Hi, welcome to a special edition of the NWI.com Political Roundtable for Wednesday, September 4th. I'm Doug Ross, editorial page editor at the Times, here with United States Senator Dan Coates. We probably have to talk about Syria first.
Well, that's the topic of the day, Doug, for sure.
And you were involved with the White House in the talks about what to do. Would you care to give us an insider's look at this?
Well, I was one of 6 senators meeting with the President's National Security Team, and at least part of that team, his Chief of Staff, Deputy Chief of Staff. We spent about an hour on the situation in Syria, going over the intelligence relative to this gas attack and the use of chemical weapons by Bashar Assad in Syria. I serve on the Intelligence Committee and so have had privy to a lot of this information. It is clear that an attack was made, that they have used chemical weapons, and that it was used by Assad and his forces and not the opposition just to lure us into something. So that point is pretty well documented. It's very well documented and settled. The real question, though, Doug, is the fact, what do we do about it? And how do we do it? And what will the consequences be? And I think there are a lot of questions that need to be answered in the context of the whole situation in the Middle East and what part this plays before we can really come to a good conclusion about what we ought to do.
Well, and that's the good question. I mean, how do you, what would be the measurable goal, the outcome that you would prefer?
Well, what I would prefer is that, one, we clearly need to and have taken a stand against the use of any kind of weapon of mass destruction. Of course, all of war, no matter what weapon you use, is not something anybody condones, but that's the unfortunate reality of the world we live in. But there's something pretty special that goes above and beyond when you talk about biological, chemical, or nuclear, because that then doesn't just target your adversary or your enemy, it puts the population at risk to some really horrible stuff. And so I think just letting this go without some type of response sends the very wrong signal. But the president really has not talked yet about in detail how does this fit into the whole context of what's taking place in the Middle East. We've had Libya, we've had Egypt, we've had Iraq, we've had Afghanistan, now we have Syria. Who knows what's next? Iran is sitting over here developing nuclear capability. I think what we need to clarify and what we don't have yet from this administration is a clear picture of what are our strategic interests, how do we best address those without becoming the policeman for the Middle East, trying to solve all these interstate problems and the intersect problems and the civil wars going on. We simply don't have the capacity to do that. We're war weary from the time in Iraq and Afghanistan. The last thing Americans want to do, and the last thing I want to do, is get us involved in yet another protracted Middle East conflict. So how we respond to this is really a critical question. And what its implications are. And I think there's still a lot of answers out there that have to come forward from the administration before I'm in a position to basically say yes or no.
We saw the response, the British response to the idea of a coalition. How big a coalition do you think the United States needs to go into this?
Well, first of all, we need to determine what is in our best interest. If we can't get everybody on board, including the UN, et cetera, maybe we shouldn't do it. We have to define what is in the best strategic interest for the United States. Then sell that, hopefully, to a number of other countries. Now, Britain has turned it down. Their parliament has turned it down. And France yet seems to be with us. The most important coalition I think we need for support is the Arab League. These other countries in the Middle East that don't want to see happening in their country what's happening in Syria or what's happened in Egypt. They've given us some support. We don't know exactly how much. I think that's important. If we're going to take any action there, we need to have support from the Arab League, those nations that are more moderate, that don't want to see happen in their countries that's happening in Syria.
I realize that it's hard to imagine a leader using weapons like this against his own people. God forbid that should ever happen in the United States or Canada, Mexico, anywhere else. United States was getting rid of some of its stockpile of these, even in it was VX nerve gas, as I recall, in Indiana.
Right.
So, what are the U.S. capabilities to be able to deal with something like this? We've been neutralizing our stuff.
We have, but we know that some of these nations have stockpiles, major stockpiles of this. Syria has it stockpiled all across the country. Securing that, not just to prevent use by the current regime against its own people, but falling in the wrong hands of the opposition. We know the opposition is composed of those who are legitimately trying to overthrow this despotic regime. But we also know it's been infiltrated by elements of Al-Qaeda and people who, should they be successful, aren't going to necessarily turn to the United States and say, oh, thank you very much, we're going to be real partners with you here. There's civil war going on in these countries. There are numerous various jihadist groups that are trying to infiltrate the opposition. So we have to be very careful that we just don't simply say, oh, well, let's take the side of the opposition, give them all the weapons that they need, they'll throw Assad out, and turn to us and say, hey, well, thank you very much. No, turn to us and say, hey, we got the weapons now, we hate you just as much as the other guys did. And that's the complexity of the Middle East, which is why I think we continue to need a strategy here that we all understand that is not just about punishing Assad for using chemical weapons. It's what are the implications of this for future? Are we going to get drawn into something? Are we going to end up with another Iraq or another Afghanistan? These are decisions that I think need to be debated before we come to a final conclusion here.
And just to put this into perspective, when you're talking war-weary and Americans and so forth, people who are in middle school, middle school students, have never seen the United States at peace or wouldn't remember it. Yeah. It's an astonishing.
It is. We're living in a very complex, very dangerous world right now. There are nations like North Korea, Iran, pursuing nuclear weapon capability. These are game changers, big-time game changers. We're not getting support from Russia. They're siding with Syria. The Chinese have taken a standoff position on this. So you're right. There are young people here who have seen a pretty war-torn, dangerous world growing up and haven't been able to experience a time of peace.
And when you're talking about China and Russia, it sounds like, the world is asking for volunteers, and those two nations stepped back, and we're left standing in the place trying to figure out what to do.
They like to see the U.S. mired down in this stuff, and they think it weakens us. And it does. As I said, we're not the world's policeman. We're not the 911 that some country in the Middle East calls and says, send your troops in here. We've done that. Mixed results. We pulled out of Iraq, and Iraq isn't solved. We see war going on there, bombing attempts and terrorist attacks every day. Afghanistan, we're withdrawing gradually from Afghanistan. We haven't solved that problem. So I think we just have to be careful that we are not the receiver on the 911 call saying, oh yeah, well, troops are on the way.
Well, you'll remember that this is this year is the 60th anniversary of the end of the official end, I guess, of the Korean War, and that was one that the United Nations led. Of course, the United States was the lead country in that, but it seems to me that the United Nations isn't taking the lead in subsequent actions like this, for example.
Well, it's very difficult, the way the United Nations is structured, for us to accomplish anything where we're cohesive. The Russians, the Security Council consists of Russia and China, and they have veto power. One country can stand up and say no, and everybody else has to abide by it. It's not majority rule, it's total consensus. The Russians love to just say no to everything that we think needs to be done. So if we wait for the United Nations to pull something viable together to deal with these problems, it's never going to get done, not under the current structure. It's a place to go and debate, lot of diplomacy and so forth, but action under United States nations control is pretty far-fetched in this instance and in many others.
Well, you obviously know about diplomacy from your time in Germany as U.S. ambassador there. And you also know, because of being a colleague of then Senator Dick Lugar, what his life's mission was
Right.
to remove these weapons of mass destruction. How's that cause going, and who's taking up the?
Well, I really commend Dick Lugar for taking on that initiative with the breakup of Russia, USSR. They were overrun with nukes and loose nukes, and what Senator Lugar and Senator Nunn teamed up to do, the Lugar-Nunn-Lugar, I guess they called it, program, has denuclearized and destroyed a lot of these weapons. Unfortunately, there's a proliferation of this. Korea is pumping them out. North Korea is pumping them out. Pakistan was sharing, is not doing it now, but they were sharing nuclear weapon capabilities through Dr. Khan and his network. So still a lot left to do, but still it ought to be the goal of the world to try to rid ourselves of these weapons of mass destruction, because the end result is almost too horrific to contemplate.
Well, and I'm trying to figure out if, say, you send a couple of Tomahawk missiles into a chemical sarin stockpile. Do you do more damage releasing the gas than sending somebody in covertly to do that? And how you send somebody in covertly, I frankly have no idea.
Yeah. Well, this is the challenge for us in terms of dealing and securing these weapons, chemical weapon sites. You can't drop a missile into one of those without releasing the all the consequences that come with sarin gas or nerve gas or whatever it is. And so you have to go over. You have to get to. You have to have a program in place to secure that and make sure it gets into the right hands. And you have to destroy some of the infrastructure that houses this or manufactures this. I've been briefed by the military. We'll continue to follow this as a member of the Intelligence Committee in terms of where this stuff is, how best we can secure it, how best we can prevent it from falling in the wrong hands, and how best we can keep the current regime from using it.
Okay, well, good luck with that.
Yeah, good luck is right. It's complex.
It is. Well, you worked on the White House with that, negotiations. You've been working with the White House on federal budget issues as well. We should probably turn to the budget. Here we are in September. October 1's coming up pretty fast.
Well, I've been on a crusade since I came back to the Senate in terms of our fiscal plight and the growth of out-of-control runaway spending, which is going to take down our economy. It's unsustainable. I've been pleading with the White House to say, can't we put a long-term viable plan in place that puts us on the right path to fiscal balance? And it will be good for the people, our economy. It'll be good for all those people out of work. It'll get our economy moving again. But there's so much uncertainty if we don't come through with some sensible long-term plan. Right now, it's been careening from fiscal cliff to fiscal cliff to fiscal cliff. Uncertainty. Businesses don't know whether to expand. They don't know what the economy is going to look like 3 months out, 6 months out. We've been through a whole series of really serious negotiations and talks and discussions about how we can get from here to there. Unfortunately, that kind of came apart just within the last week or two, when we simply found ourselves on a different page. I was saying we need to go big, we need to put something in place, run it out over a period of 10 to 20 years, get us on the right path, but we must address the runaway entitlement spending, because with the baby boom retirement, 10,000 people a day, these programs are unsustainable in their current form. And so we need some restructuring. It's not taking people's Medicare or Social Security away, it's doing the kind of things necessary so that they will be solvent programs in the future, and that we won't be robbing Peter to pay Paul, with the younger generation having to inability to fund all that's necessary to provide for those. I thought we were making great progress. In the end, the president just simply wasn't willing to go there. We've basically said, okay, if there's a change of mind, change in plans, we're ready to sit down with you again. But 6 months of really concentrated work directly with the president and directly with his top budget people, his chief of staff and deputy chief of staff and head of Office of Management and Budget, the key people in this. We laid out all our ideas and concepts. We had very substantive discussions. In the end, we couldn't come to agreement. I'm very disappointed with that.
Well, and so's the country.
Yeah.
I can tell you that. One of the challenges, I think, is you have a generation of millennials who
Yes.
are coming up, essentially the children of the baby boomers, and it's
Yes.
a bigger generation than the baby boom generation. And, with all this uncertainty, how are you going to create the jobs for these millennials to be able to support their parents?
It has to be through growth of the economy. And I think we can get this economy moving again if we can send the right package together to the investment world, that we're getting our act together on this budget problem that continues to add more debt and more spending. We're at $17 trillion of national debt. It's going to explode if we keep going forward with all this baby boom retirement. And these millennials, these young kids coming out of high school and coming out of college, I mean, they're waiting tables, they're tending bar, they're doing part-time jobs. That's not what they went to college to get a 4-year degree for, or what they got the training for vocational education for. And yet, our economy is growing at such a slow pace, there just simply aren't jobs there. And employers are telling me, as I talk to them all across Indiana, employers are basically saying, I can't see the future. I can't expand my business or expand my plant or hire more people. The Health Care Act is playing into this also. I mean, that's having these distortions in the economy in terms of hiring. So I really feel for these kids, who, get their training, come out of school, have to move back in the basement with mom and dad. It's not the last thing they wanted to do. I sure didn't want to do it when I got out of college. And the best job they can get is a part-time job at some type of service center or retail or restaurant or whatever. That's not what they were trained to do. And it's amazing statistics. And some of them are prolonging staying in school, but it racks up more debt, hoping the economy will improve before they get out. That amazing statistic came out that law school graduates, kids who have finished their 4 years, taken 3 more law school years, thinking, okay, I'll get a law degree that'll position me better. 50% of last year's graduates can't find a job practicing law anywhere, any form of law. They're out tending bar, waitresses, retail stuff, and so forth and so on. My view is we have to get a hold of this runaway spending, put confidence back in the economy, grow this economy to create those kind of jobs going forward in the future. And frankly, 5 years now of very tepid growth has not brought about the right result.
It sounds like Congress and the President and the White House are very much to blame for those problems. I mean, if there's
the
certainty.
policies that this administration has put forward to improve the economy and grow the economy for 5 years now have not worked. So rather than personalizing it, the president's a bad guy or a good guy or whatever, Congress should be controlled by Democrats or Republicans, I think you just have to face the reality of the policies they've put in place haven't worked. So shouldn't we try something different? And I think given all the problems we've had with getting this economy moving, we should try something different. That's what the 2012 election was about, but the people voted to continue the current leadership. We're now another year and a half into that. It still hasn't worked. So that's why I was so discouraged about our budget talks. I mean, the president basically saying, no, we're going to stay on this current path. Well, this current path has not led to the kind of opportunities for Americans, decent job, get married, buy a house, raise kids, secure in the fact that you can pay the mortgage. You're not going to have to foreclose your house, or you're going to have your job and not be laid off 6 months from now.
You've said that you don't want the federal government shut down. Not all your colleagues feel that same way.
Don't.
How do you get them to change their minds?
Well, listen, we all think, I think we're unanimous in terms of the current health care plan that was passed. One-party control is just overwhelming. It's not being able to deliver on its promises that were made. And so I think repealing that plan and starting over with something more doable and sensible is the way to go. Right now, though, with Harry Reid in charge of the United States Senate and the President basically saying, nope, this is my plan, no way I'm changing it, we're not going to prevail by threatening to shut down the government, and particularly at a time when the economy is so fragile. And now we're potentially heading into this conflict again in the Middle East. The last thing we want to do is say to the troops, sorry, you can't get a paycheck. Say to people who administer Social Security, sorry, we're not going to be able to roll out the payments on the right schedule, and shut down the whole government. It would just play havoc with our economy. I think the better approach, which I've proposed, is to delay everything for 1 year, put this in front of the American people, and say, Republicans, well, of course, we'll have to come up with a viable alternative. We can keep doing this with the health care plan, but we see that this isn't working the way they promised, or we can look at this proposal. But the American people are going to have to decide this at the polls in November of 2014. So that's why I would like to do I think the best tactical position here in order to address this issue is for us to delay everything for a year. The President already delayed the employer mandate. I think he should delay the individual mandate also. Why give employers a waiver for a year and not give individuals? Still force those individuals. You got to buy into this plan whether you want to or not. And so I think that delay would give us a chance to have another referendum on how the American people want to go forward with health care, and that's the proposal I've had.
Speaking of health care, I think even President Obama likes being referring to it as Obamacare now.
Listen, if it was Coach Care and it was working out the way it's working out under Obamacare, I would not want my name attached.
Well, we won't call it that, so no. I think you're safe. But the big news in Indiana yesterday was that the Healthy Indiana Plan was approved.
Exactly.
With a couple of nuances to that. One, I think, is that you have to be at or below the poverty line rather than slightly above it. Mm-hmm. So that means those people who are above it leave the Healthy Indiana Plan. They go into one of the health exchanges that are being set up. Mm-hmm. Why don't you talk about, you were kind of involved in this, why don't you talk about your role in all of this?
Well, mine's a peripheral role because this basically meant a decision between the state, under the governor, and Department of Health and Human Services in Washington. But I was very pleased that we were able to get the 1 year extension of that, because this is an alternative that I think needs to be modeled and tested. And so far, the results look pretty good. Now, where you draw that line, whether it's poverty or 110% of poverty or whatever, we can debate that. But the concept of the plan, I think, is much more affordable, much more effective than what the Obamacare plan is turning out to be. And so we can be a model here in Indiana for perhaps the country in terms of something that works. Mitch Daniels put this in place. It has like a 98% approval rating of people who use it. It addresses the uninsured issue and the low-income issue. So we now have a chance to demonstrate this over the next year that hopefully will influence where we go with health care. I mean, we do have to address health care. There are a lot of problems with it, but I just don't think the one-size-fits-all Obamacare that was passed without thorough debate and opposition is the solution. It hasn't turned out to be that solution, so let's try something else.
Okay, is it you mentioned repeal. Of course, the House has voted to repeal it so many times that
I voted over 24 times to repeal. So, I mean,
well,
look, with this president in the White House and Harry Reid in charge of the Senate, with total support from every Democrat, there's not one Democrat in the Senate, 55 of them, that has said, I will support repeal. So that's why I think the better tactic is delay and put it before the American people and give us another shot to basically say whether we like it or don't like it.
Okay, and you know, my understanding from the American people is they like certain provisions.
Yeah.
They don't like
some of those
for
can
it.
be retained.
Right.
But yes, they like certain provisions, but somebody's got to pay for it. And now we're finding out who's paying for it. And even those who didn't think they were going to have to pay for it are going to pay more than what they thought. So a lot of the promises that, remember, the Prime President said, not one, if you like your current insurance, you can keep it. That's not the case anymore. This won't cost 1 penny more than you're paying now. That's not true at all. That's costing a lot more. Premiums are going up like crazy. Individuals are going to that don't want that government coverage. They're healthy. I don't need that right now. Maybe if I get married and have kids, that would be different later on. All this is just not proving out as to how they laid it out early on.
Okay, and we kind of, you know, circling back to Syria, we kind of saw a little bit of that with Iraq, where, you know, it was, in Afghanistan, it was, you know, set out to be, you know, what we thought. It was supposed to be a quick action, and here we are.
Once you create an act of war or get engaged, as Winston Churchill and many others who have been through all this have said, you cannot predict exactly what's going to happen. And usually what you predict happens turns out a lot different. We thought that when we deposed of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, they would throw flowers at us and we'd have a victory parade down the Central Avenue. Here we are 10 years later, and that isn't the case. We thought that we could go in, wipe out the Taliban, and everything would be fine in Afghanistan. What we're finding out is here there's a lot of this sectarian, this sect against this sect. There's a lot of internal civil war going on. Who's going to prevail? There's a fight between the moderate Muslims and the radical fundamentalist jihadist Muslims. There's Al-Qaeda infiltrating all these groups. This is much more complex than just simply sending in U.S. troops, clean it up. Thank you all very much. We love you. It's a different ballgame.
Well, and the last thing you want to do is to unify the people by having them unite against you. So,
exactly. And, you know, all those who are rushing now to support the opposition against Assad, and I do think he needs to go. You can't kill your own people and be the kind of despot and stay in place. But it's no picnic to simply say, oh, this opposition over here, they're going to just be responsible citizens and they're going to support us after we give them all these weapons. I think we've learned that they're going to they turn around and hate us as much as they hated the rulers. So this Middle East conflict between sort of the Sharia law, fundamentalist, jihadist, it's not only a war against Western civilization by organizations like Al-Qaeda, it is a war against themselves in terms of who's going to rule their country and what kind of country it's going to be. Look at Egypt. They had an election. They threw out the so-called leader and despot. The new guys came in. The Egyptians said, hey, that's not what we were bargaining for. The military took over. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on intra-country that we can't solve. We can't just go in there and say, follow us, do what we tell you, or our military will solve the problem and everything is hunky-dory. It's not working that way.
well, you've got some tough decisions ahead of you. And
boy, this is, we got challenges this fall that are big. I mean, not only the Obamacare, the fiscal situation, the debt limit issue, and now Syria, and who knows what the headlines will be tomorrow.
Well, I wish you well. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for. This has been a special edition of the NWI.com Political Roundtable. We'll see you next week.